A bit of forewarning. There's gonna be some fucked up shit ahead. I'll start off with some background information. My mother was a truly evil person. I don't mean she scolded me or spanked me once. I mean she was a sadistic, awful excuse for a human being whose only sole concern in her life was to satisfy herself and hurt people in the process. I've been told once upon a time she was a good person who tried to be kind and help others, though I have to take other people's word for it. She was a highly intelligent woman who even went to a very locally prestigious college and received a master's degree in psychology. She had an affinity for the human mind, how it worked. She was like Rain Man with understanding people and how to get into their heads. This I can attest to. Though she might have initially set out to get that degree to help people, the only purpose it ever served was to aid her in her efforts to lie and deceive, manipulate, control, abuse, and ultimately mentally break anyone she deemed fit. Here are just some of my stories, living with a truly evil person. I was only ever conceived because her and the neighbor despised each other, and my mother's idea of fun was to seduce the neighbor's fiancé and convince him to leave her. She then intentionally got knocked up, and once it was confirmed, she threw him out of the house. When I was still in the womb, the doctors urged to abort as I had a hole at the base of my spine. She asked if there was any risk to her, to which she was informed that the only risk would be to me, as there was a high chance I would be born with a lifelong debilitating and painful deformity. I was carried to full term and eventually born. She took great joy in telling this story, saying things such as, "You were born out of spite. You'll only know spite. You were born because it was useful to me, and that's your only purpose in life. I could have aborted you. I should have. You fucking owe me." To this day, I've never met the man that got her pregnant. It's important for me to make clear that rare were the times my mother was ever physically abusive to us kids, though the times she was to anyone were awful. She was a very large woman, standing around 5'10" and weighing at about 250 pounds. She often used this size to intimidate people, and when that failed, she would use it to beat the shit out of them. When I was very young, I think around 5, my mother had one of my sisters and I in the car. I remember thinking the car was unusually loud. I remember my sister silently sobbing in the back seat. I remember a loud screech and then being jerked forward in the seat. The seatbelt hurt. My mother practically threw herself out of the car and had the door slammed shut before we'd even stopped. I looked back to my older sister and tried to express my confusion. She told me to stay quiet and cover my ears. I did, and for a while I heard nothing. Then my sister started bawling, so I uncovered them. Then I'd heard yelling and smashing from inside the house my mother had gone into. The yelling sounded very angry. I knew one voice was my mother. The other I couldn't tell. My mother's voice got louder, and so did the smashing. The other voice went from angry to scared. I remember it sounding like some of the horror movies I snuck peeks at through the cracked open doors late at night. My sister was begging me to cover my ears while almost hysterical, and tried to force my hands over my ears again. But then the door banged open, and my mother came running out. She flung herself into the car, and the screeching happened again, and the car was loud again. I don't remember anything else about it. It wasn't until many years later it was explained to me that my mother and aunt had some long-standing argument at the time, and it eventually culminated when my mother, who was absolutely hammered, listened to an angry voicemail from my aunt. She loaded my sister and I into the car and drove drunk over to my aunt's house. The noises I heard were them arguing, and after a while my mother snapped. The smashing was her ripping down the furniture my aunt had used to barricade herself, then smashing a chair over my aunt and beating her with one of the legs. She almost died, apparently. My aunt is a sweetheart of a woman with a heart of gold. She's only ever loved my sisters and I, and I always envied my cousins for that. Once when I was a bit older, however old you have to be to go to preschool, my mother came and picked me up. She seemed strange, but she was really nice. It seemed off, but to my brain it was just the greatest thing. She was in such a good mood and wanted me to be too. I remember her talking a bit funny though, and one of the school staff who helped load kids into cars seemed very concerned. She kept asking my mother weird questions, and eventually asked me if I was sure I wanted to go with her. This was a crazy question. That was my mom, and she was so happy to see me. Why wouldn't I want to go with her? I remember my mother having a really weird smile, but she was looking past me. I don't know how long the drive was, but I remember it being weird and jerky. Then my mother was panicking, and she grabbed my arm really hard and stuffed me to the floor in the back seat. She threw a bunch of stuff over me and told me we were playing hide and seek, and that I had to be absolutely quiet. I told her I didn't want to play, but she told me I had to, and to shut up and stay still so we could start. The car stopped, and there was a man's voice that was muffled. They talked for a while, and I remember hearing the man say, "Just get home now or you're getting hauled off." She thanked him and went home. I heard the door open and shut. She was gone. I don't know how long I stayed there, but I was so scared that I'd break the rules of the game, so I stayed. After what felt like a really long time, I had to pee. But I knew it was against the rules to move. So I stayed. And stayed. And eventually I just went to the bathroom on myself because holding it was so painful. I started crying, but made sure I didn't move or to make too much noise, because that was the rules. I remember that eventually the door was ripped open, and my oldest sister threw the blankets off me. I started crying and apologizing to her. I was so sorry that I wet my pants, and so sorry that I broke the rules. "Don't tell Mom I broke the rules, please." She just hushed me and hugged me for a long time while I cried. It was dark out now, and I fell asleep in her arms. My mother started drinking as soon as she woke up that day. When she picked me up, she was so drunk and high on who knows what. She was barely coherent enough to talk to the school aide. On the way home, she was pulled over by a cop. I can chalk the cop up to letting her go to it being a small town and a different time and not knowing there was a child in the car. But why the aide let me go with her, I'll never fathom. I have since learned that I'd been in the car for several hours. My sisters tried frantically to wake up my passed-out mother, to ask where I was. When they failed, they went looking. The oldest of my two sisters had found me, forgotten in the car. They never told my mother, and they washed my clothes so she would never find out about the accident. When I was in kindergarten and the internet was just starting to become a thing, my mother discovered what she believed to be love through an online chat room. The man she met was named Jimmy, and he lived in Indiana. He came to visit us once, brought my sisters a shirt and a pair of shoes, and me a remote-control Humvee. That was enough for my mother to move us from our hometown of Helena, Montana, to South Haven, Indiana. Her and my grandparents fought a lot over the next few weeks. Then the house was packed into a U-Haul truck, the car put on a dolly, and the four of us loaded in and off we went. After several days and a few times getting lost, we arrived at Jimmy's house. There was Jimmy, his adult son, and two kids, a boy and a girl, who were about the age of my sisters. I have no idea whose kids they were. They were just there. My mother and Jimmy spent the next few days in his room, and I never saw him come out. His son sat in the living room drinking beer and watching TV, and us 5 kids all stayed in one room with a single mattress on the floor, 2 or 3 pillows and blankets and some sleeping bags. The room had clothes and toys all around the edge, just piled up. The kids were polite, and we all passed time by playing, but they were quiet and nervous, and didn't really talk much about themselves, just asked about us. I remember my oldest sister trying to go out for a walk once, but there was some yelling, and she came back through the door with a red cheek and crying. My other sister and I tried to figure out what was wrong, but she just sat in the corner, huddled and crying. The little girl told us that kids weren't allowed out of the room except to eat. After some days, I have no idea how many, I remember my sister poking me awake. She seemed nervous, but told me to get up. I think it was night, or maybe morning. I got up on my knees and looked around. On the mattress were the boy and girl, and they were naked. They just sat there like that and told us to take our clothes off. The younger of my 2 sisters and I asked them why, and they said it was a game, and that we had to play. So we got naked too. My oldest sister just sat in the corner, hugging her knees, and watched us. We all kind of poked each other a bit here and there, and then the door opened. It was Jimmy's son. My sister and I were so afraid we were about to get yelled at, but he just cracked his beer and leaned in the doorway. He scratched his neck brace and said, "Keep going." The little girl took my hand by the waist and started rubbing her tummy with it. The memory ends there. I'm grateful for that. My sisters and I have never once talked about it. It seems very soon after that my mother broke up with Jimmy, and we got our own house in Portage, Indiana. I've never shared that story with anyone. When I was around 9 or so, we were living in the suburbs of Gary, Indiana. It was a rough, fucked up place. We were poor, white, and very much a long way from home. And the ghetto knew it. I can't tell you how much I got my ass whooped by the other kids. I had been raised to never, ever hit a girl. So when my 3 main tormentors became 3 little black girls, I was pretty well fucked. They kicked the shit out of me on the daily. Got to be a pretty fast runner, though, for a fat white boy. Got smart, too. Knew when they'd be at the park, which entrances they'd normally block. I learned real fast that some streets they would absolutely not go down. At the time, I didn't know why, but looking back, I think it was because of their brothers, and where those brothers' gangs didn't own the turf. While I was busy spending my days running and making friends who weren't white and also were willing to protect my goofy ass, my older sister had thrown herself into school and every related program she could, and was almost never home. My oldest sister was always off somewhere knocking boots with some guy. My mother had no job. Hadn't since we moved to Indiana. The only reason we had housing was because it was all Section 8, and the only reason we had food was because my mother was almost unparalleled in her ability to scam the government and any sort of financial aid, welfare, or food share program. Countless were the sob stories we all had to participate in after rehearsing with our mother. Countless were the agents who bought into our crocodile tears. During this time, my mother was always drunk or high on crack or both. There was a revolving door of equally fucked up men she met online. They'd come in, date my mother, and most of them were abusive to us. This was the time period where my mother coined her favorite saying that we all had drilled into our heads. I don't have children. I have servants. We were treated accordingly. She never did anything but spend time in her chat rooms and get fucked up. We were responsible for the cleaning, the cooking, and the bills. My older sister had to get a part-time job at Wendy's just to pay the power bill and other shit we needed. If we wanted something, we either had to find the money ourselves or ask our grandparents. The latter was only allowed if we were able to squeeze them for cash, which of course upon getting, was to immediately be given to her. There were always the holidays though, like Halloween, where we were allowed to do whatever we want. And the only cost was when we got back, we had to give all our candy to her. And of course, if we didn't earn enough, we had to go back out. We quickly learned the best time to go out is around 11 or 12 at night. Most people are done and just dump their bowls in their bag. We also learned to make regular trips to a stash spot and come out with nearly empty sacks and tell people we barely had any candy so they would give us more. We also learned we could trade parts of our costume with each other, and most people wouldn't remember us. Christmas was great. Sometimes we even got our gifts. Sometimes we got to enjoy them for a while before they inevitably got pawned or sold for money. That was a recurring cycle. Every time we had something nice, the days were numbered until our mother pawned it. The only console we had for years was a Super Nintendo with Super Mario World 4 or some shit. Although when the PS3 had been out for a few years, we did eventually manage to scrape together some money and get a PS2 for the first time ever. We spent days taking turns playing the 3 games we had. Surprisingly, we got to enjoy that for a couple months too, until it eventually got pawned. See, my mother had turned it into a scam. She would pawn all of our shit, then give us an amount we had to con our grandparents for. She would use the money to unpawn things, and all the profit went to her. Our only solace was every summer, my older sister and I got to spend 3 months with our grandparents back home in Montana. But of course, they had to pay and come get us, and then to bring us back. As for life there, eventually a group of Mexicans moved in next door. and took our family under their wing. They fed us kids when we were hungry, and they made sure nobody in the hood fucked with us. They couldn't give a shit about our mother, but us kids were untouchable. I thank my lucky stars for Jose and his sons Omar and Marco, who became my only two real friends. I love that family. The grandma, though she couldn't speak a word of English, would grunt and point us into seats at the table and make us eat until we were full. We called her Mexigram. There are other horror stories from this time too. I'll try to be brief. My mother once got so drunk that she took my older sister's boyfriend out into the street and surrounded him by a group of cheering drunk Mexican neighbors from the weekend party. Proceeded to beat the shit out of him and berate him for dumping my sister on prom night. He had it coming, I guess. He was some douche from Puerto Rico that tried to be suave with anything that had a pulse. Then there was the time that she got shit-faced and drove me to Wendy's. And while going around a corner, she went so fast that the passenger door swung open. The seatbelt also didn't work. As I'm falling out of the truck, my head a foot off the ground, she didn't even slow down. She just laughed and said, "Sink or swim, bitch." I chose swim. Eventually, when I was 11ish, we had to pack everything in one night, and my Gramps came to pick us all up. Turns out my mother had debt to too many dealers, and was told if she didn't pay, they'd collect. My oldest sister stayed behind, now with 2 kids and pregnant with a third, living with her boyfriend and neither had a job. We were back in Montana 2 days later. My Gramps had driven out the whole way, only stopping for food and fuel. My sister and I had to leave almost everything we had. Our mother told us that we had to pack 3 things to bring each, and they all had to be small. Only so much room in the trailer, you see. All her stuff had to fit somehow. She made me leave behind my cat Vanilla, who'd I owned since rescuing her as a stray kitten. The only thing I'd loved or ever felt loved by. That was okay, though, because at least my mother got to bring her cat Tiger. She locked Vanilla and her newborn litter in the shed and left them to die. My sister was able to sneak a call to Jose, who broke into the shed and took them. I'm told he got them all a good home, all together, with a family that she seemed to like. When I was crying on the way back to Montana, she told me to shut up. When my Gramps said, "He's heartbroken, you need to respect that," she replied with, "He's my child, and I say he doesn't deserve any." We'd been back living in Helena for a total of 2 months before I set my bed on fire, called the cops on myself and was able to get arrested, and eventually placed in a children's hospital. Best 10 months of my childhood. 3 months back home and I knew I had to go bigger. One death threat to my vice principal later and I'd bought myself a year away from her. Got placed in some shitty group home where the normal staff were great people, but the manager liked to torment us. Didn't bother me. Her worst punishment was a fucking vacation. While I was here, my mother fractured my sister's arm in an argument, and while the cops were called, nothing was done. So my sister just moved out. My mother let it happen because she was an entitled little bitch anyway. Her words. Eventually, after getting out, my mother moved her and I down to Salt Lake City, Utah, with my older sister's biological father, as they'd gotten back together. There were for some reason issues with my enrollment in school, probably due to the fact that I had received about half the schooling I should have over the years, and the years they did have records for was mostly 20% grades. I had long since given up on school. It's not that it was too hard. Honestly, it was so damn boring. They weren't teaching me anything I didn't know, and school just didn't matter the least bit in my grand scheme of things. After several months of living there, I was finally enrolled. I still didn't do anything. Just showed up to the classes they told me to and sat there. I never so much as put my name on a piece of paper at that school. Managed to get kicked out quicker than I'd planned. My sister's dad just wanted to know why, and told me I had to write a report of at least 1,500 words explaining it. That kinda caught me off guard because no one ever asked me why. So I wrote it. 1,500 words on the nose, because I'm no free laborer, and it was an honest answer. He came home and read it aloud to me in front of my mother. As he read, he started to get a shocked look on his face and kept looking at me with concern. I'd never really had that. Not from someone so close to things. Even my grandparents had been helpless to stop my mother. But this man, maybe he cared. Maybe he could help. He never got to finish before my mother took it from his hands and tore it to shreds and started yelling and smacking me for telling lies like the little bastard that I am. Years later, still in Salt Lake City, the situation was mostly the same. The three of us were living in some shithole apartment complex. We almost never had food, and when we did, it didn't last long. And I only got the stuff my mother didn't like. My sister's dad and my mother had long since relapsed back into drugs. He was working 20-hour shifts as a diesel mechanic just to not make enough money, and slinging dope the whole time just to cover the gaps. And of course, to feed their habit. Albeit mainly my mother's. I had been kicked out of almost every school around and was about to get kicked out again. She didn't do anything but drink, do drugs, and watch shitty soap operas on antenna TV. I had some crap box computer that was still on Windows 98. The only two things I could do was write on Word and play Space Cadet. I did have another PS2 for a while, until some of their friends were over while I was at school, and then the friends went into my room and stole the cables for it and most of my games, though more likely she sold them for more dope. From that point on, I had to use the power cord from some old printer. It wasn't the right one though, and the console would work for 5-ish minutes before it would shut down and took hours to turn on again. This was by far the darkest time of my childhood. I had no friends. The school and all the teachers hated me, thinking I was just some lazy moron. My family might have well been on a different planet for all the good they could do. The only grown-up that had ever cared about me had been twisted by my mother. He would get home at 2 or 3 in the morning, get fed some story by her, and drag me out of bed and yell at me for sometimes 2 hours nonstop. I'd be a mess of tears and snot and too hysterical to get a word out, and she'd be on the couch, smoking and smiling. While he was at work, and if I wasn't at school, she'd make me wear the worst clothes I had, and make me rub dirt on myself, and then drop me off in a parking lot somewhere. I was only allowed to use a payphone to call her once I'd earned enough money. But of course, only if I had the amount she wanted, plus the 75 cents to call her. I couldn't shortchange her now, could I? One day when I refused, she started getting mad. She yelled. She threatened me. As I sat on the edge of my bed, she told me if I didn't move now, she was going to beat me until I couldn't move. I told her to give it her best shot. The first hit landed right upside my ear. Hurt so bad I instantly teared up. I stood up, met her eye to eye. She was a big woman, but big women breed big kids, and I was damn near 6 foot at the age of 15. She was big. She swung again, and how I stayed upright I'll never know. She had me seeing stars and birds. Guess maybe she was right. I was born to spite a bitch after all. She told me she brought me into this world. She could sure as shit take me out of it. I smiled and said, I already told you. Give it your best shot. She slammed my door in my face and never laid hands on me again. The only friends I had in this world were our dog, Jazzy, who was a dipshit doofus Sarpé that literally loved anything he could lick, and our cat, Horty, who slept with me almost every night while I cried. Eventually, things came to a head when my sister's dad's parole officer finally caught him and sent him back to prison. And my mother had no way to take care of me, so she sold me. For drug money. To my own grandparents. She was demanding $500, but they had been bled so dry at this point that they could only afford $100 and still be able to come and get me. She took the money. A few days later, they picked me up. They could only fit my clothes and basic stuff in the truck, and I was only able to bring the 2 cats we had with me. Jazzy was left behind. He got out of the car she was living with a few weeks later, and was run over by a car. That was what I was eventually worth to my mother. $100 that got shot right into her veins. One high. That was all it cost to own me. I haven't seen her since. She tried a few times to reach out. She can try all she wants. I'll never let her back into my life. I've long since let go of the anger and animosity toward her. It's not a grudge that keeps me away. Maybe she is a different person. Maybe she's truly changed. But it's simply not worth the risk to my happiness. I don't know why she's mad. After all, she was the one that taught me that people are numbers. And that bitch is a living deficit. I know there's been some heavy shit here. I honestly can't describe how it feels to finally have some of this out after all these years. I'm doing much better now, and even though my life has plenty of problems at the moment, I'll know I'll make it. The man I spoke about, my sister's father, well, he's my dad now too. He cleaned up his act, moved back north to be around me and my sister. He's earned the title of father from me, and I've come to love him as the only father I'll ever need. My older sister is now married with a kid. She has a full-time job and makes good money, and a degree in social work that she hopes someday will use to help children like us. My oldest sister still lives in Indiana, but hopes to move her family back home where our hearts never left, Montana. She has an awesome boyfriend who treats her right, and 5 kids that are lucky to call her mama. Both of my sisters are the best mothers a kid could hope for, and I feel nothing but pride and love for them. My mother was an evil woman. She would get into your head, but it was worse than being made to feel bad. She would make you feel like you were worse than nothing, and made you believe that you deserved it. She would use any weakness, any emotion, anything she could. She'd use it against you. She was a black hole that sucked the love, happiness, and life from everyone and everything around her. She was not a mother. She was a parasite that managed to procreate. Nothing more, nothing less. That said, I do not blame my mother anymore, as it simply doesn't do any good. However, I got plenty of blame to slather around all the useless adults along the way who could have stepped in and helped, but didn't. I can't tell you how many times we tried to tell our teachers, our schools, social workers who investigated, cops who were called, anyone who would listen about the shit that was going on. And none of them, not a single fucking one, lifted a finger to help. Our grandparents even tried for custody once, but the courts ruled in favor of our mother because there's no proof of physical abuse, and children belong with their mothers. If I could get 1 minute in a room with all those shitheads, I'd make them feel the hopelessness and despair they all left us to. Dark shit aside, there are some positive takeaways I found from all this. Blood is not always family, and family doesn't always have to be blood. Despite what anyone may try to tell you, you can pick your family. You don't owe anyone a damn thing just because you were born. You didn't ask to be. It wasn't your choice. You alone own your life. No matter how bad it gets, or how dark it is, there's always a way to go forward. Do whatever it takes to find it. It's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to talk about that. Find the people who love you, no matter who they may be. Those are the people worth having in your life. Don't feel bad about getting rid of the rest. The only way to stop cancer is to cut it out. And not all abuse is physical. The worst wounds are the ones no one can see. You can survive anything. I did. And I'm by no means special. You can survive. I promise. Thanks for listening. Props if you survived the sob story bullshit novel this turned into. And have a great fucking day. 'Cause you deserve it.